The bell above the door of Hensley's general store had a particular ring to it, not the bright, cheerful clang of a new bell, but the lower, the softer sound of iron that had been struck 10,000 times and had learned, through long use, to speak more quietly. Nora Hensley knew every variation of that sound. She knew the quick double ring of a child who pushed the door too hard, and the slow single note of an older customer easing it open against stiff joints. She knew, too, the sound the bell made every Saturday morning at precisely 10 o'clock when Elias Croft came in from the cold. It was a measured sound, deliberate. The door opened only as wide as it needed to, and closed again with care. That was the whole of the man, she had decided. In the very first week she had noticed him. Everything about Elias Croft was opened only as wide as it needed to be, and closed again with care. He was 38 years old, though he carried himself like a man who had lived considerably longer. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came not from vanity but from decades of honest labor. His face was weathered in the way that the Montana hillside was weathered, not worn down, but shaped, made more specific by time and weather. He wore his coat the same way every week, the collar turned up against the November wind until he crossed the threshold, at which point he turned it down. It was a small courtesy, the kind that most men did not bother with. Nora had noticed it the first Saturday, and she had gone on noticing it every Saturday since, which amounted, she realized with a small start, to the better part of 2 years. His list never changed. 20 pounds of oats, a block of salt for the cattle, coffee, always the dark roast, lamp oil, 2 quarts, and then, at the end, one small thing that varied a length of ribbon one week, a set of brass buttons the next, a book of illustrated birds the month after that. These small additions were the only window into anything beyond the ranch, and Nora had learned, without ever meaning to, that they were for his daughter. Her name was June. Nora knew this the way she knew most things about Elias Croft, not because he had told her, but because she paid attention to the world around her. June was 7 years old and attended the schoolhouse on Pine Street. She had her father's serious eyes and, from what Nora had observed on the one occasion the girl had come into the store, a way of examining things very carefully before she touched them. She had stood before a display of hair ribbons for a full minute before selecting a yellow one, and when she finally chose it, she had said, with perfect gravity, "This one, please," as though the decision had required genuine deliberation. Nora had thought then, involuntarily, that the apple had not fallen far from the tree. What Nora did not know about Elias Croft, she had assembled from the general store's particular function as the town's central exchange of information. She knew that his wife, Caroline, had died nearly 3 years ago in childbed, and that the child had not survived either. She knew that he had rebuilt the fence line on his upper pasture alone that spring, working from before dawn until after dark for 2 weeks straight. She knew that he paid his accounts on time, every time, and that he had quietly settled the debt of old Mr. Pearson at the feed store when Pearson's harvest failed, and had asked for nothing in return, and told no one except that Mr. Pearson had told his wife, and his wife had told 2 friends, and so now everyone knew, and Elias Croft remained, as far as anyone could tell, entirely unaware that his quiet act had become a small legend in Harlan Creek, Montana. Nora herself was 26, though she was sometimes taken for older, which she did not mind. She had come to Harlan Creek from Columbus, Ohio, 3 years ago, in the wake of a broken engagement that she did not speak about and had largely stopped thinking about mostly. She had a quick mind and a quicker eye, and she had found, to her surprise, that she loved the West. She loved the particular quality of the light in winter, the way it fell pale and flat across the snow and made everything look like a drawing. She loved the mountains, which were nothing like the gentle Ohio hills and which still, sometimes, stopped her cold in the middle of a morning errand, simply by being there, immense and indifferent and magnificent. She had taken over the management of the general store from her uncle the previous spring, when his rheumatism had made the bookkeeping too difficult. She was good at it. She was organized. She had a talent for remembering what people needed before they asked, and she had a frankness about her that the town had initially regarded with some suspicion, and had gradually come to trust absolutely. She had set aside Elias Croft's order every Friday evening for the past year. She told herself it was simply good business practice. He was a reliable customer, and it saved time on a busy Saturday morning. She did not examine the habit too closely. On the first Saturday of December, the bell above the door rang at 10 o'clock, and Nora was already reaching for the oats. "Mr. Croft," she said, without turning around. "Miss Hensley." His voice was low and even. She had catalogued that voice with the same attention she gave to everything else, the way it never rose in volume even when the store was noisy, the way it never offered more words than the situation required. She turned and set the oats on the counter. He was unwinding his scarf, which was new. She had not seen it before. It was a plain gray wool, well knit, almost certainly made by someone's hands rather than bought from a catalog. She made a note of it without making a note of it. "Cold out," she offered. "Getting there," he said. He began moving through his list with the efficiency of a man who had done the same task so many times that thinking was no longer required. He was a good customer in the way that made running a store satisfying, no complaint about prices, no attempt to negotiate, no dawdling. He was, in short, the opposite of a problem, and Nora appreciated that. What she did not appreciate, or rather, what she was becoming less successful at not noticing, was the moment at the end of each visit when he glanced toward the back of the store where she kept the small shelf of books and then did not go there, as though reminding himself of a rule he had made. He always bought something for June at the end. He had never, in 2 years, bought anything for himself. She did not know what to do with this observation, so she set it aside with the rest of them. "Will that be all?" she asked. He paused. He was looking at the books. His gaze stayed there for 2 seconds longer than usual, then returned to her. "Yes," he said. "That'll be all." He paid, he nodded, and he left. The bell made its measured sound. Nora looked at the book he had been looking at. It was a collection of surveying methods, technical and dense. She set it under the counter. The storm came on a Tuesday, which was inconvenient, but weather did not consult convenience. By Thursday morning, 3 feet of snow had fallen on Harlan Creek, and the temperature had dropped to a degree that made the air feel like something solid that had to be pushed through. Roads were impassable. The supply wagon from Billings was 2 days overdue. A number of people who had come into town for various errands found themselves stranded, and Nora's store, being large and well-heated and centrally located, became the unofficial shelter of the storm. By Thursday afternoon, she had 6 people in her store who had not come there to shop. Pastor Reed from the Methodist Church sat beside her stove reading his Bible. Old Mrs. Calloway was knitting something large and indeterminate, with a focus that suggested she had been waiting for an excuse to sit down for quite some time. The Birch brothers, cattle hands from the South Range, were playing cards at the table she had cleared for the purpose, their bickering a low, constant undercurrent beneath everything else. A young couple, the Meachams, newlyweds not 6 months, sat close together and looked at each other with the soft, slightly dazed expression of people who were still surprised to find themselves so happy. And then, at 2:30, the bell above the door made its particular sound, and Elias Croft came in from the cold. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene with the careful assessment of a man who habitually reads rooms before entering them. His gaze moved across the stove, the card players, the pastor, and landed, finally, on Nora. "I was checking the fence line on the south pasture," he said, as though he owed her an explanation. "Storm came up faster than I expected." "You're not the first one surprised by it," she said. "Come in. There's coffee." He came in. He took off his hat. He looked, briefly, as though he was not quite sure what to do next, which was the most uncertain she had ever seen him, and she found it unexpectedly affecting. "Mrs." Calloway looked up from her knitting and patted the empty chair beside her. "Sit down, Mr. Croft, before you let all the warm air out of yourself standing there in the middle." He sat. He accepted the coffee Nora brought him. He said thank you, which she had noticed he always said, not the reflexive, barely registered thank you of habit, but one that sounded as though he meant it each time. The afternoon passed in the slow, easy way of hours that have nowhere to be. The Birch Brothers card game grew louder and then quieter. Mrs. Calloway finished whatever she was knitting and started something new. Pastor Reed fell asleep over his Bible with the untroubled confidence of a man at peace with his own conscience. The Meachams talked to each other in low voices and laughed at things no one else could hear. Nora found herself at the far end of the counter, reorganizing a shelf of tinned goods that did not particularly need reorganizing, when Elias Croft appeared beside her. He was holding his coffee cup and looking at the shelf of books with the same careful attention he always gave it. "June's been asking about the stars," he said. He said it without preamble. The way a man says something he has been turning over in his mind for some time. "She wants to know the names of them." Nora considered this. "I have a book on astronomy." It came in with the last shipment from Billings. She moved to the shelf and found it a slim volume, illustrated, the pages thick and cream-colored. She held it out. He took it, opened it, and looked at the first few pages with the focused attention he gave everything. "She'd like this," he said. He looked up. "Do you read much, Miss Hensley?" The question surprised her, which was unusual. Very little surprised her. "I do," she said. "Quite a lot, actually." He nodded, as if this confirmed something. "What kind of things?" She considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "History, mostly, and natural philosophy." "I like to understand how things work." She paused. "Though I'm not opposed to a good story, if it's an honest one." Something shifted very slightly at the corners of his eyes. It was not quite a smile, but it was the territory adjacent to one. "Honest how?" "Characters who behave like actual people," she said. "Not like what people are supposed to be, like what they are." He was quiet for a moment. "That's harder to write, I imagine." "Considerably," she agreed. And then, without any particular decision being made, they were simply talking. It was nothing dramatic. It did not feel like the beginning of something, or at least, Nora told herself it did not. They talked about the storm, and then about the winter, and then, somehow, about the survey maps she kept behind the counter for customers who were staking land claims, and then about the surveying book she had set aside under the counter, which she handed him without explanation, and he accepted without asking for one. The afternoon turned to evening. The storm did not relent. People arranged themselves for the night the storeroom was opened. Blankets were found. Mrs. Calloway organized the logistics with the authority of a woman who has run a household for 40 years and finds the process of settling strangers into temporary shelter to be much the same, only simpler. Nora made soup from what she had on hand, and everyone ate, and the talk was easy and general and warm. Later, when the others had settled, Nora sat at the counter doing her accounts by lamplight. She did not look up when she heard the quiet creak of a floorboard that told her someone was still awake. Elias Croft sat down on the other side of the counter, the surveying book open in front of him, his coffee cup refilled by his own initiative. "You don't sleep much," he said. It was not a question. "I sleep when the accounts are done," she said. "And how long does that take?" "Depends on the week." He turned a page. She ran a column of figures. The stove ticked quietly. Outside, the wind moved in long, low sighs around the corners of the building. "My wife used to stay up late," he said. He said it simply, without caution and without weight, in the way a person speaks of something that is no longer a wound, but has become simply a fact of geography, a landmark in the interior landscape. She said the nights were the only quiet part. She was right, Nora said. She usually was. A comfortable silence settled between them, which was, Nora thought, not as strange as it should have been. She went back to her figures. He went back to his book. At some point, the lamp burned lower, and she turned it up, and he thanked her for it, and that was all. The storm broke on Sunday morning, and by afternoon the roads were passable again. People gathered their things and departed with the slightly dazed warmth of strangers who have been thrown together by weather and have come out the other side knowing each other better than they expected. Mrs. Calloway pressed Nora's hand and told her she ran a fine establishment. The Birch brothers paid for the tinned peaches they had consumed without asking and left without apology. The Meachams left last, holding hands, and the young wife turned at the door and said, "Thank you, Miss Hensley, for the warmth." Elias Croft was the second to last to leave. He put on his coat. He wound his gray scarf. He turned the collar up, and then, at the threshold, turned it down again, and picked up the astronomy book and the surveying volume, which Nora had wrapped in brown paper while he was repacking his gear. "I didn't purchase the surveying book," he said. "Consider it a loan," she said. He looked at her. His gaze was direct and unremarkable, and it lasted precisely 2 seconds longer than was necessary. "Thank you, Miss Hensley," he said. "Come back when you've finished it," she said. "June can tell me what she learned about the stars." He nodded, and the bell made its careful sound, and he was gone. The following Saturday, at 10 o'clock, his list was the same as always. The oats, the salt, the coffee, the lamp oil, and at the end, he set the brown paper parcel on the counter. "June says there are 88 constellations," he said. "She's decided to memorize all of them." "That's ambitious," Nora said. "She's an ambitious person," he said, and the quiet pride in his voice was a simple and complete thing. He left without any addition to the Saturday routine beyond the returned book. The Saturday after that was the same, and the one after that. But something had changed, or rather, something had settled into a new position, the way furniture rearranges itself after a room has been thoroughly cleaned. Their exchanges were still brief, still practical, but they were no longer quite as cautious. When she said something dry, and Nora waited to see if he would catch it, he caught it. When he made an observation that was more precise than the occasion called for, she matched it. They had, without announcing it, established a frequency. It was in January that she first noticed the man from Billings. His name was Franklin Doyle, and he came through Harlan Creek every 6 weeks on the circuit between Billings and the smaller towns to the north, selling pharmaceutical supplies, fine tobacco, and a line of books imported from the east. He was 40, perhaps, with a broad forehead and an easy, practiced smile, and the kind of clothes that announced, without vulgarity, that he was doing well. He was well read, which he let be known within the first 5 minutes of any conversation, and he had the gift of making whoever he was talking to feel as though they were the most interesting person in the room. It was a skill, Nora recognized, because she was not without social perception, but it was also, she suspected, largely a professional instrument. He came into the store on a Wednesday in January and stayed for nearly an hour, talking first about the books in his sample case, and then about a lecture series he had attended in Chicago, and then about the particular challenges of the bookselling trade, and then, somehow, about Nora herself, where she had come from, what she had studied, whether she had read the latest translations from the French. She had read most of them. He was delighted. He came back the following Wednesday, and the one after. On the third Wednesday, Elias Croft came into the store for a bag of nails and some lamp wicking. He was not expected. Saturday was his day. He came in quietly, as he always did, and Nora was at the far end of the counter talking with Franklin Doyle about a collection of natural history essays, and when she looked up and saw Elias, there was a moment in which she could not have entirely explained her own expression. He nodded. He found his nails. He found his wicking. He set them on the counter. Franklin Doyle turned with his easy smile and extended his hand. Franklin Doyle, pharmaceutical and literary trade, out of Billings, passing through. Elias shook it. "Croft," he said. "Rancher?" Doyle guessed. "Yes, hard winter for it," Doyle said pleasantly. "Yes," Elias said. He paid Nora for his nails. He looked at her once directly, briefly, and she found that she could not read the expression in his eyes, which was unusual, because she had become quite good at reading the small catalogue of expressions that crossed Elias Croft's face. He turned his collar up, and the bell made it sound, and he was gone. That night, Nora sat with her accounts longer than they required. She was honest with herself, as a habit and a discipline, and honesty required her to acknowledge that the look on Elias Croft's face when he had found her talking with Franklin Doyle had been something. She could not name it. She knew only that she had wanted, very badly, to explain that the conversation had meant considerably less than the one she had had across her counter by lamplight on a storm-bound Sunday night. She had not explained it, because there was nothing between her and Elias Croft to explain, and nothing he had said or done that gave her any reason to think there needed to be. But the next Saturday, at 10 o'clock, when the bell rang and she reached for the oats, she found that she had reached for them a little faster than usual, and that when he came through the door, she looked up from behind the counter the way a person looks towards something they have been waiting for, which was a thing she had not done before, or had not admitted to doing before, which amounted, she decided, to more or less the same thing. February settled hard over Harlan Creek. Elias's Saturdays continued without variation, which meant that they had become, for Nora, the fixed point of her week around which everything else arranged itself. She would not have confessed this to anyone because it was impractical, and she was a practical person, and yet there it was, stubbornly true. She began to notice that she chose her shawl more deliberately on Saturday mornings. She began to be aware of the difference between a conversation that was pleasant and a conversation with Elias Croft, which was something else, not more dramatic, but denser somehow, as if the words carried more weight per syllable when he was the one speaking them. Franklin Doyle came through on a Wednesday in February and asked, with his easy, practiced directness, whether Miss Hensley might allow him to call on her. She was kind. She was clear. She said no, with enough warmth that it left no affront, and with enough firmness that it left no ambiguity. She did not examine too closely why the answer had been so immediately apparent to her. On the last Saturday of February, Elias came in at 10 o'clock. Oats, salt, coffee, lamp oil. He lingered at the bookshelf. She waited. He took down a small volume poetry, American, mid-century, and stood looking at the cover in his considering way, and then set it back. Nora stepped out from behind the counter. She had not planned to do this, but she had been honest with herself all winter, and honesty had been leading her, step by deliberate step, in this direction. She took the volume of poetry from the shelf and set it on the counter beside his purchases. He looked at it. "I didn't ask for that." "You've been looking at it for 3 months," she said. She kept her voice even. "Every Saturday, you look at the shelf, and then you look away." He was very still. He looked up at her slowly. "I set aside things I think people need," she said. "I'm usually right about it." The store was empty of other customers. Outside, the February wind moved a loose shutter somewhere up the street with a rhythmic, hollow knock. "Miss Hensley?" he said, and stopped. She waited, which she was good at. "I am not a man who speaks easily," he said. "About things that matter." "I know," she said. "I've noticed. I've been aware," he said, with the deliberate care of a man selecting each word the way he would select a tool for a delicate job, for some time, that Saturdays have become. He stopped again. He looked at the poetry volume. "I look forward to Saturdays." "So do I," she said, plainly, without decoration. He looked up again, and this time she held his gaze and let him read what was there, which was not complicated and was not hidden, and which she was done pretending was not present. "June asks about you," he said. "She says you remembered what kind of ribbon she chose and ordered 3 more in the same shade." "Yellow suits her," Nora said. "She told me you must be paying close attention," he said. "She's 7. She thinks paying close attention is the greatest possible compliment." A pause. "So do I, as it happens. I pay a great deal of attention to things that interest me," Nora said. "I've noticed that too," he said. They were quiet for a moment that was not empty, but full of 2 years of Saturday mornings and a storm-bound evening, and lamplight on account books, and the sound of a bell that rang lower and softer than most bells because it had learned, through long use, to speak more quietly. "I would like to call on you," he said. "Properly, if you're willing." "On Saturdays," she said. "And possibly other days," he said. He was watching her with that direct, undefended gaze that she had come to find more honest than any elaborate speech. "I imagine the store is open on Wednesdays." "It opens at 8, she said. Something happened in his expression then, not a transformation, but a loosening, the way ice at the edge of a stream loosens in the first week of March, quiet and irrevocable. It was the closest thing she had seen to uncomplicated happiness on his face, and it was, she thought, a very good thing to see. He picked up the poetry volume and placed it deliberately with his other purchases. "I'll want to return this when I've read it," he said. "I'll expect you to," she said. Spring came to Harlan Creek the way spring always comes to that part of Montana, reluctantly at first, and then all at once. Elias called on Nora on Saturdays, and then on Wednesdays, and then on Thursday evenings after his work was done, arriving with his hands scrubbed clean and June beside him, who had memorized 14 constellations and intended to have all 88 by summer. June took to Nora with the same deliberate seriousness she took to everything, studying her first from a careful distance, then gradually moving closer, the way a sensible person approaches a stove, first to feel the warmth, and then, when it proves safe, to sit beside it. Nora read to June from the astronomy book on Thursday evenings, while Elias sat nearby and listened without pretending he wasn't listening. She taught June to use the store's scales to measure things precisely, which June found deeply satisfying. June taught Nora the names of all the horses on the ranch, in order from largest to smallest, which Nora committed to memory with the seriousness the subject deserved. On a warm evening in May, when the last snow had retreated to the peaks and the meadow behind the store was green and ridiculous with wildflowers, Elias came to call without June, which had not happened before. He sat across from Nora in the small back room where she sometimes had her tea, and he turned his hat over in his hands with the particular patience of a man who has been practicing what he intends to say and has decided, finally, to abandon the practice and simply speak. "I was not looking for this," he said. "I want you to know that. When I came in here, those first Saturdays, I was not looking for anything beyond oats and salt and something for June. I was managing. I was getting through." He paused. He looked at her steadily. "You were very hard to manage past. I wasn't trying to be difficult," she said. "You weren't being difficult," he said. "You were being yourself, which is considerably harder to get past." He set down his hat. "I have a daughter who is going to have all 88 constellations memorized by July, partly because of you. I have a book of poetry on my nightstand that I've read twice, which is something I have not done with a book in 3 years. I look forward, every week, to the sound of that bell above your door. And I am fully aware, Miss Hensley, that you set that surveying book aside for me a full week before I ever thought to look at it." He met her eyes. "You saw me before I'd made any particular effort to be seen. I find I'd like you to keep doing that, for a long time. If you're willing." He was not a man for long speeches. That had been a long speech, for him. She understood what it cost, and she honored it by taking it seriously. June said she wanted to see a solar eclipse, Nora said. "There's one predicted for August of next year." He blinked, just slightly. "She mentioned that. I thought," Nora said carefully, "that if we were all going to watch it together, we ought to have a reason to be in the same place." He understood her. She had known he would. "Is that a yes, Miss Hensley?" "It's a yes, Mr. Croft," she said. Obviously. They were married in June, which had seemed appropriate, given the girl who had, in her 7-year-old way, done as much as anyone to bring them together. June stood at the front of the church in a yellow dress and watched the proceedings with the solemn attention of a scientist documenting a significant event. Nora wore blue and carried wildflowers from the meadow behind the store. Elias stood at the front of the church and spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, and did not look at his boots even once. 6 years passed, and the world turned in its slow, reliable way. Elias added a new wing to the ranch house, with a room that had bookshelves along 2 walls and a window that faced the mountains. Nora kept the store, though she brought in a young man to help with the heavier work, and she wrote, on her best evenings, letters to her family in Ohio, describing a life that had turned out to contain considerably more joy than she had thought to expect from it. June memorized all 88 constellations by June, not July, and moved on to botany with the same systematic devotion. They watched the solar eclipse together in August of the following year, all three of them in the meadow behind the store, lying on their backs in the tall grass with their eclipse glasses on, and June narrated every stage of it in precise, factual terms, and Elias took Nora's hand in his without comment, and she held it without comment, and the shadow moved across the sun, and the meadow went dark, and the temperature dropped, and the horses were uneasy, and it was, all of it, exactly as remarkable as she had thought it would be. 2 more children came, eventually a boy they called Thomas, who had his mother's quick eyes and his father's patience, and a girl they called Caroline, named for a memory kept in love, who had her father's serious face and the particular gift, evident from very young, of paying close attention to the world around her. It was the thing Nora valued most, and it seemed right that it had come back around. On a quiet evening in November, some years later, Elias sat on the porch of the ranch house while Nora read in the chair beside him. The mountains were turning purple at their edges in the last of the evening light. From inside the house came the sound of June, home from her first year at the college in Missoula, telling Thomas and Caroline something about the migration patterns of birds in the patient, exacting tone of someone who has recently acquired new information and intends to share it fully. "She sounds like you," Elias said. "She sounds like herself," Nora said, without looking up from her book. "Yes," he said. "That's what I meant." She looked up at him then. His face in the evening light was the same face it had always been, shaped by time and weather, opened only as wide as it needed to be, and behind that, everything else. She knew it the way she knew the sound of her own doorbell. By long and grateful repetition, she put her hand over his. His hand turned and held hers, the way it had in that meadow years ago, without comment, without ceremony, as if it were simply where her hand belonged, because it was. The mountains went from purple to black, and the first stars appeared, and Caroline came to the porch door and announced, with the gravity appropriate to the discovery, that June had said there was going to be a meteor shower, and could they please all stay up to watch. They stayed up. That is the truth about a quiet love. It does not make itself known all at once. It arrives the way certain kinds of understanding arrive, not in a single bright moment, but across a long accumulation of ordinary ones. In the sound of a bell, you have learned to distinguish from every other bell, in an order set aside before it is asked for. In the patient act of looking at a person not for what they might become, but for what they already are. It is not built in the great declaration, though the declaration matters. It is built in the steady return, the same door, the same time, the same quiet recognition that this is the person whose presence makes the rest of it make sense. That is the whole of it. That and the stars. Thank you for being here today, friends. I'm glad you stayed to the end. Until next time. Sometimes the truest kind of love doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up, the same time every week, and quietly makes itself indispensable. Pay attention to the people who remember the small things about you, who set aside what you need before you think to ask. Those people are rare, and if you happen to be one of them for someone else, don't wait too long to let them know. A small note for you. Friends, this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted with the hope of bringing you a moment of warmth and entertainment while leaving behind a little something worth carrying into your day.